This is the beginning of genuinely just kind of signposting, because people tell you wonderful things, but this is the beginning of our Noisy Women segment. So we will have Henry talk for around like 10 minutes, and then we'll have Gwen, and then we'll have some questions, and then we will move into the performance. That's it, and I'll keep in time. That's what we're all, everyone enjoy.
I should say before we do that, by way of introduction, we're all Noisy Women, and I'm just here to kind of riff on what's being said. I might not say anything at all, actually, but we are proud members of the Noisy Women.
See if you can help us, I'm sure you will. Will we just introduce ourselves quickly as well?
Yep.
We can talk. So I'm Henry McPherson. I'm a pianist, composer, improviser. I'm also a research fellow at the University of Manchester, and I'm really pleased to be down here. I was just saying to Steve, I don't get down to London that much, so it's always nice to come and kind of be around so many people all the time.
Yeah, my name is Gwendolyn Kassenaar. I'm a visual artist based in London. I'm one of the co-founders of Noisy Women, together with Farah and Maggie and Marion, who are not with us today. I work across painting, drawing, performance, do a lot of live painting on stage with musicians. And I think my work is really about being in the moment, connecting humans, connecting the sound to the visual, connecting the energy. And I tend to work in a very embodied way, so movement is kind of a natural part of how I work.
So I have drawn a mind map of ideas, and a lot of these have already been brought up today. It's one of the privileges and also challenges of coming towards the end of the day is that people bring things up and yes, absolutely. So hopefully I can speak into some of the things that have been spoken about already. Particularly in the presentation performance from Free Women, I think touches on a lot of the things that I was thinking of speaking to in some sense from my own position. When I was asked to kind of participate and say something about the Noisy Women, my first thought was, well, how do you really describe the Noisy Women, or how do you approach the Noisy Women? What on earth are the Noisy Women, really? I think the Noisy Women is, from my perspective and this sort of affiliation that I have with them, with us, I don't know, a group of people who are trying to understand what forms of freedoms improvisation and free improvisation and interdisciplinary arts and practices can afford us, what they can give us. I think it's also kind of a set of ideas around what it means to build community, to expand access, to understand inclusivity, and to try and enact some form of better social, political, moral, ethical arrangement than we have at the moment. It's no secret that we live in incredibly difficult times. We've got a lot of scary things going on, increases in the rise of the far right in particular, music and art sectors being gutted, rampant sexism, homophobia, transphobia, racism in all quarters of community, not least in the insidious flags which have been put up recently. And so I think it's interesting to think about how groups of people in kind of underground community practices of different kinds are trying to enact alternative social systems in whatever way they can. And particularly from my perspective, what that looks and sounds and feels like at the embodied level. I'm an improvisation researcher. My focus is really on what it is to do improvising practices, what that means for us, not just in terms of politic, but also in terms of our interpersonal connection, in terms of our aesthetics, and in terms of what we think about ourselves. So I wanted to touch on a few things that I have in front of me, and they're in no particular order. One of them, I suppose, is around a concept which comes from Tina Kreckles, a saxophonist who I mentioned earlier. Tina Kreckles wrote a fantastic PhD where she brought up the question, am I just reproducing what she termed patriarchal aesthetics when I perform in free improvisation as a saxophone player? As a woman moving in free improvising circles, who gets praised for being louder than the drummer in the band, who gets praised for playing as loud and as fast as a saxophonist like Peter Brotzmann. When I stand up in front of people on the stage and I'm reproducing these kinds of timbres or sonorities or textures, what does that actually mean for me and myself? And I came across Tina's work during my PhD, where I was also trying to ask similar questions about what the dominant paradigms, the dominant ideas within free improvising contexts might be, not just aesthetically, but politically and in terms of the body. I'd like to tell you a little story about my experience with sonic masculinity, which is Tina Krekel's term, and kind of, hopefully, as I say this, link it through to the noisy women and broader conversations that we've had today. I was mentored by an extremely well-known free improvising pianist who is a man who I'm not going to name. And I had a very early morning mentoring session where I went into the rehearsal room. I'm a pianist, we're both pianists. And what I was asked to do was essentially play as loud and as fast and as virtuosically as I possibly could for like 25 to 30 minutes. And my mentor played so loudly and virtuosically and fast and hard and brash that at the end of the session I found that I had excruciating pain down my tendons. And bearing in mind I've been playing the piano since I was 4 years old, and I know how to look after myself and I know what my technique is, I was really struck by this. And it got me thinking, okay, well, what am I participating in? If what is valued within this particular practice is playing as loud and as fast and as virtuosically and as brashly as is possible, is that actually something that I want to be part of? And so my question kind of resonated with Tina's in some way. I think that we know that there are issues of, exclusion and practical and social exclusion within free improvising contexts. There always have been. Maggie Nichols, very sad that she couldn't be here today. Maggie Nichols is here.
Oh no, she's not.
No, she's
Sorry.
not.
I thought she was, but she's not.
That's fine. It's my heart. Big love to Maggie. One of the kind of founding figures of free improvisation in the UK, didn't make it onto the front cover of the Wire magazine until 2 or 3 years ago, despite having nearly a 6-decade career. Thinking back to the work of the Feminist Improvisation Group, who've already been mentioned in the discussion today, I think it's interesting to think about how the way that FIG moved against dominant paradigms of masculinity within free improvising spaces is also very much tied up in the way that bodies move and are allowed to do certain things on stage, which gets me into talking about the noisy women. It was no surprise at all to me earlier when the free women were in this kind of, what would you describe it as, like a tower on the floor?
Yeah, tower is a great name.
Great. So this
We thought pile, but I like tower.
Pile.
We can do tower now.
Okay, tower, pile of meat, all these things in the middle of the floor. Because historically within free improvisation, corporeality and the body and expressive movement and an extension of the body beyond technical instrumental virtuosity is something which has been harnessed as a feminist technique. There's increasing evidence of, there's increasing backup through queer and feminist scholarship around free improvisation that the predominant performers who are using extensions of the body and moving beyond sound-centered practices tend to be queer people, women, other people of marginalized experience where that marginalization is rooted very deeply in an embodied experience and not just in abstracted ideals of freedom which exist only in a sonic space. So when we talk about the work of the noisy women, what really interests me is how disciplines merge together, but how the body moves beyond a relationship with instrument, thinking about sound, how it moves into dance, how it moves into working with materials, how it moves as it paints, how it moves in space, and how the transitional points between sounding and moving and singing and visualizing and speaking and orating and all these different kinds of things are blown open. This is a characteristic of a lot of sort of contemporary and experimental practice in music as well, but there's something interesting about how the noisy women pull this together, and I think it stems from a real ethic of inclusiveness, an ethic of expansion, an ethic of kind of access to new forms of practices. So that's one thing I wanted to talk about. Maggie was already talked about earlier today, I think it was in your presentation, Maureen, for her opinions and comments and wisdom about social virtuosity as opposed to technical instrumental virtuosity. I think if we're critiquing things like imbalances of representation and in particular gendered representation within free improvisation, we have to think about the types of virtuosities which have historically been foregrounded within these types of practice. To me, social virtuosity, which is really epitomized by the work of the noisy women, is not to do with an abstracted ideal of technique and a freedom which exists only in kind of an aesthetic space, but a way of asking, who are you when you're on stage with each other? What do you bring in all that you are someone said earlier, your mental health, kind of what you had for breakfast, all of your history. How can I accommodate you? How can I make space for you? What does it look like if I nourish what you're doing in performance? What does it look like if actually we have a bit of a disagreement, but we negotiate that in the space? And that is to do with the people who are on stage, not to do with someone sitting behind an instrument and abstracting it into a sonic level only. The sound is really important, absolutely, and we're in the music and as process day, so we're talking about sound. But what I'd like to emphasize as we move later into the performance are kind of visualizations of what collectivity looks like, what care looks like, what sensitivity looks like, what diversity looks like within this type of work. I think that emerges from what I've observed of the Noisy Women's process, which is, if I can put some words on it, a really complex negotiation of lots of different people trying to come together and make something happen, to give space as much as possible while also maintaining an identity and bringing your own ideas. And what I find fascinating as we sort of expand the ideas of free improvisation in the 21st century is how that by necessity pushes us beyond traditional paradigms or traditional ideas of person-instrument relationship and more into person-person relationship, which is what I think ultimately this kind of work is really all about, or certainly it should be about, if it's to mean anything at all. And I'm actually going to stop there, I think, because I've said a lot of things, and hopefully we can have some discussion around
What he said.
Okay.
You, Gwen. Yeah, thanks, Henry. I think you said a lot already,
Sorry.
so no, don't worry. I will put in the bits from my own perspective. As you said already, we're very much the interdisciplinary approach is at the heart of our collective, and we have movement, as you already described, poetry. I bring the visual art to our collective, and it's very much a way how we can express our notion of inclusivity, which is at the heart of our practice. We can that way bring people together, bring cultures together, which we express through this metaphor of bringing the art forms together. And as you already beautifully said, we are all individuals with our individual practices, but we also come together as a collective. And so when I speak now, it's a kind of intertwining of how I work as an individual and with the collective, because they're completely intertwined. And that is not just in process, it's also very much we share core values, as you already addressed. For example, in my individual practice, I conceived a narrative performance, which I titled A Trajectory to Unsuffocation. And it was a kind of autobiographical piece about self-discovery and the empowerment of the individual to dare to be who you are, whether that is gender, sexuality, different abilities of bodies. It was very much about accepting this diversity in society, and Maggie referred to that piece as the personal is political. So it's a message that comes through along that line. And when I talk about music as process from the kind of visual art point of view, when we perform and I paint live, it's very much a two-way dialogue. So a lot of people assume, oh yeah, you paint according to your inspiration of the music, but it's also the other way around. So I might make a color or a gesture, or there is a swoosh of paint, and that might inform the musician for their next note, or it might initiate a turn in the music. So it's really about this two-way dialogue, and maybe that refers also to your notion of negotiation, how we are together in the space. And it's a process for the audience too, because they see the art unfold right in front of their eyes in real time. And so it really connects the senses of hearing and seeing simultaneously as it happens. And for me personally, the way art and sound work together is that I have synesthesia. So when I paint, and I hear, especially it relates to the timbre of an instrument, I see a color. It's called chromesthesia, that type of synesthesia, but it's broader than that. So I see also shapes and patterns and moving images. And I know Kandinsky wrote a lot about this, where he kind of fixes the synesthesia, the color, with the instrument. But for me, it's much more flexible than that. So, for example, I was working with pastels when Steve, when you played on the piano, and it was like black and white orthogonal patterns kind of moving through the space. Whereas in a collaboration with Meg Morley on piano, they were like sinuous light blue ribbons. So it really, for me, depends on how the instrument is played as well. And the way I work with music can be, like I just described, the color with the timbre. It can be rhythmic, it can be melodic. There's, pitch, lots of different ways how the visual interacts with the sound. And when I work with colors, for example, if I use the color yellow, I tend to work in 2 tones or 3 tones. Like I might have a creamy yellow, a lemony yellow, and a sunny yellow. And to me, they're like chords, and there's spaces between the different colors. And when I work, I always have quite strict color palettes. So the way that kind of works in my mind, it's like the key in a piece of music. There is a dominant color in the palette. I never go all around the color wheel. And the difference between art, visual art, and sound or piece of music is obviously the elements of time and space. And music has a duration. It's finished, it's finished. And art, in the traditional sense, when it's on canvas or paper, has a permanence. It's on a surface. And when the performance finishes, the painting is still there. And sometimes people ask me, what's more important, the performance or the painting? So I'm going to not say anything, and I'm interested to hear your thoughts about that later on. We talked about being in the moment, and I was really amazed when I read this book called The Doors to Perception by Aldous Huxley. I'm sure it's familiar to many of you. He does an experiment with mescaline under scientific guidance, and he examines how he responds to music being under the influence. And he describes having no memory, no notion of time, so therefore no awareness of a musical structure. And I was amazed when I read that. I thought, that's exactly how I feel when I paint life. I am with every note as it happens, and I don't have a recollection of what came before. Although in my instance, I guess you could say that what's on the canvas or on the paper is a physical manifestation of what came before. And if you're into this kind of neuroscience, how our brain works with music, there's a great book written by Daniel Levitin, who is both a neuroscientist and a musician. And he wrote this book called This Is Your Brain on Music, which is a fascinating read that I can recommend. I'll say a few words about improvisation. As a visual artist, I'm kind of weird because my practice is more like a musician, and I practice for hours and hours in my studio without any specific outcome. And without going too much into detail, because I know we are under time conditions today, it's all about letting go, and it's about trusting your gut and trusting this kind of voice that comes from another place when we switch off our thinking head. And I think as a collective, we don't just trust our own gut, but we trust each other. And recently, in the last year or so, we've spent more time together. We've had a beautiful development day in Cambridge. We spent a whole weekend at Maggie Nichols's beautiful place in Wales, and we've come closer as artists, more intimate, more physically closer, I think, on stage. And we've now done things in performances that wouldn't have happened if we hadn't spent that time together. For example, this pink net you see here, Joe brought that to Leon C. And at one point we were all underneath this net. And we hadn't practiced that or envisaged that, it just happened. Because that was kind of the comfort that we had with each other coming out of our time in Wales. Or when we had the performance in the Vortex, I ended up painting on Nikki Smith's body, who's a dancer. We were moving together, and all of a sudden my pastels were all over her face, and then she grabbed my pastels and started painting on me, and our bodies were completely intertwined. And those things wouldn't have happened if we hadn't had that development time together. And I think that's where I leave it, because I had similar thoughts about far-right politics. I can say things about movement, but I think we covered it together. Yeah? Yeah.
Amazing. But what both of you said amazing. I've got nothing to add. I'm done.
Well, thank you. I've got perfect timekeeping. Yeah. Anyone got any questions?
Or
Or thoughts? Or feelings?
Got some thoughts. So I'm one of the other co-founders of Noisy Women, and my view of it is it's actually a kind of creative social experiment. We're finding out. So each kind of creative arts framework has a different way of thinking, and we also try and play with people from lots of different. We've got people from different countries that are now joined us, so we've gone global, and it's about different ways of thinking coming together, and it's about the connection that you get through creative arts, as well as so it's not just social virtuosity, it's the collective virtuosity. So the collection, it's the group as a whole with their different modalities getting together to create something that's bigger than all of us. So it's basically fighting fascists. That's what we're doing. Yeah.
I think so it's maybe, because it would be great if we could share thoughts, but I don't know why I feel it's appropriate at this point to share with you my experience of the first Noisy Women gig that I did. So I'm a classically trained oboist who comes to free improvisation for political and physical and musical reasons. So I am used to highly disciplined, virtuosic, very professional behaviour in the most traditional masculine sense that we've described today. And I was delighted to be invited to come and play, and I was told, come along, if you get to this place at 4 o'clock, we'll get together, we'll run through, there'll be some food. And in my head, what I thought was, we'll get together, there'll be some food, and we'll have a run through. And I got there, not knowing what to expect beyond, we are going to sound together. And there was food and there was chat, and I ended up in the garden talking to a saxophone player called Sue Lynch. And then we realised it was 6:30 and actually everybody had gone. And everybody had gone to the gig. So we walked around the corner to the gig, and there were loads of really nice people there, and we were like chatting, and at some point Farah, who kind of coordinates and leads really beautifully, said, well, maybe we should get on the stage now. And we did. And what came forth was the most beautiful experience, sonically and musically, for me. And I think for everybody that was there, and you know those gigs that you go to where you can feel it in the room, the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. It's like, yeah, this is really there. And that gig was that. But it is the weirdest gig I have ever done as a professional musician, because nothing about that process was as I have ever done before. And I love that, I love that you said trust. I love that it's about trusting that we will all commit to respecting one another and going with the sounding. And that is a political act for me. I think it is. Over to you guys. Any other thoughts? We've got 5 minutes. Anna.
I was just wanting to ask Henry, how did you respond to the experience with your mentor? Like
Pain. And questioning. I mean, I was also, to set the power dynamic straight, this is still when I was a student at the time as well, as like 10 years ago. And this is also someone who's very tall. I'm not very tall, and there was a kind of a physicalized presence, and you're working with two massive great Koch instruments, you know, the grand piano, which is also an industrial machine. It's this kind of, this mark of industrialization and kind of empire we could get into. I've come back to it several times as a kind of a moment which is really pivotal for me in my understanding of my relationship with my instrument and also my body. And for context, you know, I've worked a lot in dance and with dance as a mover in the last 8 years as well, trying to understand actually that I have permission to move in certain ways, and that reflects back on this. But it made me think about quite a lot about the mythology and canon. And this is something that a lot of the kind of queer and feminist writers around free improvisation, Maria Sappho, Hannah Reardon-Smith, Dana Myers, people have written about who's mythologized it to what extent and why, who's canonized and why. And I just can't help but feel like I really felt that in my body at that point. And it was dangerous. So it's not something that I look back on fondly. In my teaching, and as someone who's taught quote-unquote free improvisation in a conservatoire, although we can have a conversation about whether that's legit or not, you know, I've really tried with students not to push them into that kind of place. But it would be remiss of me not to say that I still find myself falling into tropes where if I'm on stage with a bunch of lads, which happens quite often, I go to these open mic improvisation nights where I'm put on stage or I'm put with a trio or something and people start strong-arming each other. Sometimes you rise and you try and meet that. And I find myself increasingly frustrated and fed up in those kind of circumstances. Because it for me, it smacks of a kind of performativity that I'm not very interested in, certainly not anymore. And that's a kind of a learning curve as someone who has been encultured within a culture of music making which prioritizes, you know, being able to do fantastically fast, loud things effortlessly, and also the body somehow being kind of disappeared in the process. You know, we are not the thing, the instrument is the thing. Yeah, does that answer your question a little bit? Sorry, it's...
Yeah, it tells me kind of where your thinking's gone since then.
Yeah.
But potentially you rejected it, but that it's quite magnetic.
The experience itself.
Yeah, the black hole kind of sucks you towards it.
Yeah, it is a black hole, and I've also, with students and in myself, I've found myself falling off the other way. So where it's like, I'm not going to do anything. Tina Kreppel's talked also about laziness as a feminist free improvising technique, which is very interesting. I have been in contexts where I've tried to then like perform a kind of stasis or withdrawal or something, and it's not been of the moment, and for that reason it's been bad, for want of a better word. You know, there's no good or bad, we know that. But so what I tend to emphasize actually is what's happening right now. Who are you meeting right now? Who are you right now? What do you need right now? And I wrote down on here as you were speaking the need to hold everyone else within your sphere of kind of understanding, within your periphery, all at once at the same time. Even if you're an individual, being aware of what else is going on the stage. If you get too hyper-focused that you're just so much in flow with your own thing of what you're doing, I think you can't give what's necessary to everybody else who's on the stage with you, and it should be a reciprocal process. Of course, we enter into all kinds of weird transpersonal, intersubjective spaces where we don't quite know who's doing what and where it comes from, and that's really wonderful, and that flow is fantastic. But I think if we want to understand improvising practices ethically, then I think we also need to hold on to that attentiveness to each other. That's kind of what I've learned, I think, out of this, or certainly what I try and teach when I can.
Can we, just before Dana rounds it up, I just wanted to say, because we haven't said it and we should say it, that this evening